Bueno.
So welcome everyone to this last weekend of activities for the Revolutionary Youth Seminars. Today we will talk about learning from LGBTQIA struggles, making changes in times of crisis. So we will speak with Terry Conway, who is a LGBTQAI feminist and eco-socialist activist from Britain. She is a member of the leadership of Socialist Resistance and of the Bureau of the Fourth International. She has been involved in all 8 of the seminars on LGBT liberation organized by the International Institute for Research and Education in Amsterdam, including the one that is happening online this year. Terry was politically active over AIDS, including in her trade union, and thinks there are important lessons from that time of organizing for us today. So thank you, Terry, for joining us today. And I will just give the floor to you for your presentation.
Thanks, Chiara. As has been said in many different ways throughout the camp thus far, this pandemic, like other moments of deep crisis with social, political and economic dynamics, both reveals and exacerbates the deep divisions that already exist in our societies. I'm going to try and look during this educational at the particular way this pandemic has impacted on our communities across the world, how we've reacted, and the lessons we've learned from previous struggles, particularly from organising around AIDS, and the solidarity we've tried to build. But before I start on the narrative, I want to situate what I'm saying in the theoretical framework I'm using. In 2003, the 15th World Congress of the Fourth International agreed a resolution on LGBT liberation. This resolution came out of discussions which started at the first seminars we organised at the IRE in Amsterdam, so it was a product of our collective work and reflection. We say in that text that the link between the oppression of LGBT people and women's oppression is key to our understanding, and the struggles for liberation are consequently closely linked. And we then go on to look at the operation of heterosexism, which, like sexism, is expressed in all spheres, from politics, employment, and education to the most intimate aspects of daily life. I defend the main stances of this text, which was written almost 20 years ago, but I'd change some of the emphasis if I was involved in writing it today. I'd certainly say much more about the position of trans and intersex people, their organisations and struggles. But I'd also say more about the sexual division of labour in the family and the way that's reproduced in the labour market, and how that impacts on discrimination, both around pay, around status, and around harassment against women, especially Black, migrant and Indigenous women and LGBT people in paid work. There are probably more things I would change which I haven't thought through yet, and I wouldn't have the scope to fully explore in this presentation. Certainly one of the things that's happened during the pandemic is a discussion about what sort of work is socially useful, what is essential. Health, care, food cultivation, processing and distribution, and some types of local transport are those essential works, while arms sales, aviation, especially for short distances, advertising and much more are dangerous and damaging on so many levels. I'll return later to the implications of this for LGBTIQA people. I want to talk now about the particular ways the pandemic has impacted on our communities. These areas all intersect with each other and reinforce each other. So the first issue I'm going to look at is the question of health. AIDS activism was a major learning experience for LGBTQIA communities. While obviously there are major differences with C19, in terms of the nature of the disease itself, its major methods of transmission and more. There are also important parallels and ways that we can build on and generalise the lessons we learned through that campaigning. AIDS activism saw a strengthening of more radical organisations within our communities, as the ways of organising of more traditional organisations ignored sections of our community that were most impacted, for example, sex workers, areas where we needed to develop our strengths, such as within the trade unions to protect our rights at work. And they also developed means of organising through organisations like ACT UP, which were way too militant for the liking of the traditional organisation. AIDS activism at its best also built alliances with other communities impacted by the disease, with sex workers as a whole, with migrant African communities in the global north, for example. It confronted racism as we do today over C-19. Then the focus was primarily anti-African racism, whereas today anti-Chinese and anti-East Asian racism is at the sharp end of what global governments promote, as well as anti-migrant sentiment more generally. With AIDS activism, we argued that there were no at-risk groups, but only risk activities that anyone could engage in. This was ideologically important in terms of destigmatizing particular communities, but also practically vital in terms of reducing transmission. We developed safe sex and safe practices, health from below rather than health from above. This is even more important today when even more of our health services have been further undermined by the ravages of neoliberalism and by the exclusion of migrants. Because of the way AIDS unfolded, the battle with the pharmaceutical industry was central. The need for antiretrovirals to be produced for need, not profit, and indeed the need for free condoms, and to be particularly accessible to people in the global south. This aspect hasn't, in my experience, been prioritised in terms of organising during this pandemic, despite the fact that big pharma seem to be controlling a lot of the work towards a vaccine in the hope of making vast profits. And it's maybe something we should give more attention to. Another aspect of the health crisis we should be aware of with COVID-19 is the way that regular health and drug provision has been adversely affected by the demands of the pandemic and the appalling way many governments have responded. While the media in Britain, for example, have rightly highlighted the fact that cancer sufferers, for example, have been neglected, there's been much less attention to those in the LGBTQIA community who've also been impacted. Many trans people and many who are HIV positive, for example, have been less able to access the drugs on which they depend during the pandemic. This is particularly the case for those who, even in normal times, have to import those drugs from abroad on the black market, particularly, but not exclusively, people in the global south. But it's also true for many in less extreme circumstances as well. I want to go on to the question of economic exclusion. Especially in the global south, LGBTIQ people are disproportionately represented in the informal economy, where people have been particularly negatively affected by lockdown, as it's exceedingly difficult to work. In many cases, the market for people's goods is dependent either on tourism or access to people who are economically better off than the sellers. And the pandemic has closed this down in many cases. The withdrawal of public transport also has a negative impact on that sector of the economy. And it's usually impossible to work safely in the informal economy. To physically distance doesn't work for most sex workers, although a small number have moved online, or for those who sell goods to individuals through close contact. Women, trans people and sex workers, overlapping groups obviously, are the hardest hit by all of this, but it's wider than that, particularly for gender non-conforming people, i.e. those who might be perceived as belonging to what's assumed to be the opposite gender in societies where abiding by the binary is strongly imposed. There are higher unemployment rates amongst our community. For example, a disproportionate number of us work in hospitality, which has been hugely affected by the pandemic, and there are likely to be huge further job losses in the months ahead. This is particularly a problem for LGBTIQ people who are migrants. Even in the global north, we're more likely to be on the economic margins, and there are more and more studies that show this. For example, 52% of queer households have faced layoffs or reduced employment, compared to 39% of overall households in the Canadian state, according to a recent survey. The next topic I want to explore is the question of the removal of what limited civil rights parts of our communities have. The potential for human rights violations is escalating in some regions of the world under the guise of disease control measures. Usually this is general repression, which has a particular impact on those who are already marginalised, including on our communities. There's an important point here that has potentially programmatic implications, that in some cases, measures introduced to protect women based on the gender binary then exclude LGBTIQ people, especially those who are gender non-conforming. In Panama, for example, they introduced different shopping days for men and for women under the banner of minimizing disease exposure. And similar measures were briefly introduced in Peru, although they were rescinded after a week, and several Colombian cities. There are a number of instances resulting from these measures of trans people being arrested and harassed by the police for supposedly violating these mandates. There are also instances where repression has been targeted at LGBTIQ people. In particular, there was an instance in Uganda where an LGBTIQ shelter was raided, although similar provision for other sections of the community was not targeted by the police. The drive to criminalisation may well be wider, either through legal changes against us or discriminatory behaviour from the police and the army, at a point where it's more difficult for organisations and communities to respond or even to know what's going on. Militarisation exists in many parts of the world, Palestine, Kashmir. But for example, in the Philippines, Duterte has used the pandemic to strengthen that militarisation by the introduction of new legislation. And in societies like Brazil and the US, right-wing populism and the accompanying militias are being whipped up by Bolsonaro and Trump. This is all part of what our communities alongside others are suffering. On the legal front, Hungary is particularly problematic, particularly given that Orban has the power to suspend any existing laws during the state of emergency introduced to deal with the pandemic. At the same time, in May, the Hungarian government introduced a law which would make it illegal for anybody to change the gender under which they were registered at birth, which is clearly discriminatory against trans and intersex people. Amnesty International and many LGBTQIA organisations have opposed this law And it's not, I can't actually find whether it's been signed off, whether it's actually implemented. But its intent is very clear. But it's not only in Hungary. In Britain, the governing Tories have backtracked on their previous commitment to reform the Gender Recognition Act, which would allow self-identification for trans people rather than the current deeply medicalised model. And they're using the pandemic to hope that we won't notice this new assault. Next question I want to deal with is the question of domestic abuse. All the way through the pandemic, feminists across the world have rightly pointed out that the slogan of stay safe, stay home doesn't help for many of us, because home is not a safe space for everyone. But for our community, it's a particular issue. For LGBTIQ young people who are trapped in their birth families and isolated from their chosen families and communities. It's an issue for trans people whose gender identity is not accepted by previous partners or by their birth families, and for bi women or lesbians who might have been forced into relationships with men by their birth families, and for men who have sex with men but are not out. We should also be aware that domestic abuse is not unknown in lesbian and gay relationships. The fact that there's violence even in our community may be hard to accept, but the heterosexist, individualistic and possessive norms of this vile society are something that means we don't always live in a haven away from all of this. All of this exists in a vicious circle with homelessness in our communities as people flee increasing violence, but in a situation where community organisations may be barely functioning and shelters even more so. In some contexts, this can also lead to the increasing criminalisation of people fleeing violence. We're also dealing with an increase in hate speech and hate crimes. The notion of gay plagues, as far as I know, arose with the development of AIDS, HIV, but it's been repeated with other diseases and crises, even when methods of transmission don't have anything to do with sex. I didn't know this, but they were repeated, for example, during the Ebola crisis and with the Haiti earthquake. And again, during COVID-19. These are particularly perpetrated by fundamentalists from Christian, of all sorts of different sects, and Islamic, with increasingly common rhetoric in which they talk about gender ideology, and they're being repeated today. Obviously, such hate speech is likely to lead to an increase in actual physical crimes, either where lockdown doesn't exist or is being opened up, or against those who can't observe lockdown in order to survive economically. As I said before, particularly those in the informal economy. And hate crimes, even without physical attacks, can have deep impact on people's mental health. The need for solidarity with those in our communities at the sharpest end of such attacks are stronger than ever before. And for those of us for whom physical organising remains impossible or limited, we need to find new ways of effective online organising. On the other hand, it's easier to invite international speakers to online events than physical ones, so we should make maximum use of the opportunities, the new opportunities we have today. Finally, in terms of the types of impact, I wanted to look at the whole question of isolation and the impact on our mental health. The pandemic has led to the closure or very limited availability of LGBTIQ social spaces, both commercial ones and community run, or an increased danger to use them because of increased hate crime, police repression, militarisation. This is obviously worse for people who are not out, where such spaces may be the only places that they can be themselves, and even less accessible to people who are forced back into their birth families against their choice. The closure, inaccessibility of support groups and organisations is even more an issue in the global south and in communities suffering digital poverty. It has a particular impact on young LGBTIQ people forced into returning to their birth families because of the closure of their places of study and or because they've lost paid work. Even for those people previously living with their birth families, the fact that these sources of sanity are no longer physically available has a big impact. And even where online alternatives exist, it's not possible for many to access them, because even if you have a smartphone, it's no consolation if you don't have the space to use it in private and you've got some homophobe breathing down your neck, or you're terrified of what their reaction might be. We also have a situation where many relationships have been broken apart by the closure of borders or the reinforcement of the family in this situation by increased poverty and by increased repression. Not being able to publicly grieve for people who've died because relationships are hidden or have no legal status was a constant reality during the AIDS crisis and had an impact on in many countries on the subsequent struggle for legal recognition of our relationships. And I think we're seeing similar patterns reproducing themselves today during C19 on an even greater world scale. And it's also the case that the absence of positive images reinforces the negative self-images that we may not have fully dealt with in ourselves when there's nothing there to counterbalance it. And that really does have a massive impact on the mental health of LGBTIQ people. Even in normal times, the level of self-harm, the level of attempted suicide, particularly amongst young people in our communities, is heartrending and gives the lie to the idea that we've already achieved everything we were fighting for. And this is obviously even sharper in this current situation where our organisations have been closed down or less accessible than before. I want to finish by talking about how we've been responding and open it up for other people to contribute, because I don't have an entirely global picture. The first, so I call this section Visibility and Resistance. Obviously, the eruption of the Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd's murder has been the most significant development of international resistance since the start of the pandemic. Black Lives Matter was founded by 3 queer women, so to that extent it was always favourable to the involvement of our communities. But the second incarnation this year, in the context of the pandemic and of the outrageous behaviour of the Trump administration to the pandemic, has sparked the biggest mobilisations ever in support of Black trans lives. And I think this iteration of the movement has also generally been more militant and more inclusive at a global level. So the murder of 2 trans women, Dominique Remney-Fowles, 27 years old, of Philadelphia, whose legs were severed mid-thigh before her body was dumped in a canal, and Rhea Milton, 25, from Cincinnati, Ohio, who was shot, are tragically not unusual. At least 21 trans or gender non-conforming people have been killed in the US already in 2020. Those are actually last month's figures. And it's probably considerably more than that. Those are the people that we know about. The murders of Dominique and Rhea also coincided with Trump's announcement that he was going to eliminate a regulation brought in by Obama to prohibit discrimination in healthcare against trans people. New York, Los Angeles, Boston, and Chicago at least saw important mobilizations, probably the largest ever on trans rights, and extremely significant in being Black-led. Banners and placards proclaiming Black Lives Matter have also been significantly visible both on general Black Lives Matter protests and on LGBTQIA protests in a number of countries, certainly in the US and Britain, illustrating that new or stronger alliances are being built during the pandemic, which I think is hugely significant, because although the early gay liberation front in the 70s did draw a lot of inspiration from the Black Power movement, unlike with the second wave of feminism, the organic links, certainly in Europe, were quite weak. And I think it's very important that much stronger links are being built now. Sex worker organising, including LGBT sex workers, has also been important in many parts of the world. As I argued earlier, sex workers have been disproportionately affected as people in the informal economy, and often migrant workers with no ability to get even minimal state support and hugely under attack from state repression. So the question of self-organisation to survive materially as well as emotionally has been absolutely essential for those groups of workers. Many routine LGBTIQ activities, such as pride marches, have not happened during the pandemic or have moved online. I don't have an international picture of what that's meant, and would be interested to know from people here how it went in their countries. Other LGBTIQ activists like me have been working during the pandemic in mixed organisations such as Mutual Aid, focusing on addressing issues such as food poverty, isolation and state repression, and the way all of this impacts on the most marginalised in our societies. The extent to which this has shifted the overall political picture is difficult to assess for now, but it's certainly likely to put us in a stronger position to resist against governments and bosses who will always want to make sure that the many, not the few, pay for the costs of this crisis.